Look directly at the geography of this neighborhood. On one side, structured brick homes, and right next door, thousands of packed informal tin structures. This extreme physical divide is the baseline reality for millions of South Africans. When you place a rapidly growing population into an environment with collapsing infrastructure and high unemployment, social stability fractures. And when that tension erupts into violence against foreigners, the media and political class reduce the cause to a single word: xenophobia. While criminal elements and genuine hatred of outsiders exist, using this single label ignores the scale of the broader structural collapse. We are constantly shown the violence on the surface, the what, but we are rarely told why the physical conditions enabling that violence were allowed to develop in the first place. Accepting a purely moral framing blinds the public to the underlying decay, leaving society vulnerable to political manipulation. For decades, South Africa managed migration from across the continent. What has changed is the observable reality. The country has transitioned to an uncontrolled influx of undocumented people moving through porous borders. No functioning state allows this level of unmonitored movement by accident. The primary architects of this situation are elements within the government, whose systemic negligence sits in contrast to their rhetoric. This flowchart tracks the core economic incentive. When elites align with big business, open borders provide an expanding pool of cheap labor. By utilizing a vulnerable workforce unable to demand standard pay, corporations maximize margins while domestic wages drop. It's a profitable mathematical equation. The ensuing societal breakdown represents a deliberate trade-off, where elite economic interests prioritize cheap labor over national stability. Politicians frequently defend this lack of border enforcement by invoking Ubuntu, suggesting that true African philosophy requires entirely open doors. Traditional Bantu governance actually relied on strict, structured integration. The practice of Ukubekwa required vetting and formal processes before anyone could settle, specifically to protect the integrity of the community. When you strip away those traditional structures, you hit a brutal mathematical wall. South Africa's physical systems, its power stations, its roads, its pipelines, have finite limits and were never designed for unmanaged population expansion. Removing capacity limits triggers predictable system failures: the rolling blackouts of the grid, the rationing in healthcare, and the breakdown of transport networks. This lack of structure also invites severe security threats. In 2024, dozens of foreign nationals were arrested in Mpumalanga after authorities discovered suspected covert military-style training camps operating inside the country. The current situation directly exposes a fragile state's vital infrastructure and its security apparatus to a total, unmanaged, catastrophic overload. When extreme inequality meets collapsing public services and a surging population, society transforms into a pressure cooker. Under severe structural strain, human psychology narrows, lofty ideologies fade, and survival becomes the primary driver of behavior. These protesters act out of a rational desperation to protect their vanishing livelihoods. They are fighting for survival in a deteriorating economy. The undocumented populations crossing the border are driven by that same survival instinct, fleeing economic collapse and conflict in their own home countries. Both sides are acting rationally. The conflict is driven by a shared human condition, where self-interest is the baseline requirement for surviving a failing system. South Africa occupies a unique position. It has the physical geography and resources to serve as a genuine convergence point for coordinated Pan-African development. Instead, the current reality is extreme fragmentation. Without leadership or a shared framework, isolated clusters of different nationalities are left to fight each other for daily survival. And this follows a simple principle: where there is no structure, there is no order. And where there is no order, chaos emerges. As long as structural collapse is mislabeled as mere xenophobia, South Africa will continue to fight the wrong battle and remain a case study in unmanaged ruin.
I want you to picture a society sitting right at the absolute breaking point. I mean, we are looking at one of the most unequal nations on Earth.
Yeah, without a
We're
doubt.
talking about mass, systemic unemployment, rising crime, and infrastructure that is just buckling so badly under pressure. that rolling blackouts are, a normal part of daily life.
Right. It's an intense environment to live in.
Exactly. And when you put millions of people into a pressure cooker like that, eventually the lid blows off. You get unrest. You get street-level violence. And almost inevitably, that violence ends up targeting those who look or sound different.
Yeah, and then when the rest of the world sees those images broadcast on the evening news, they just apply a single, simple label to the entire crisis. They say, oh, it's xenophobia.
Right. It acts as this ultimate neat and tidy explanation, a one-word summary that just wraps up a profoundly complex structural crisis with a bow. But what if that one-word summary is actually functioning as a smokescreen? Welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a highly compelling set of excerpts from a script titled South Africa Beyond the Narrative of Xenophobia.
It's a really fascinating piece of writing.
It really is. And our mission today is to explore a provocative argument from that source. The idea that labeling this massive, multifaceted collapse merely as xenophobia is not just an incomplete oversimplification.
Right, it's actually worse than that.
Yeah, the author argues it is a dangerously misleading framing of the facts. So we're going to pull apart the mechanics of this argument to see the structural reality operating beneath the surface.
Before we jump into those mechanics, let's establish a clear baseline here. If you are listening to this and wondering if we are taking a political stance, we aren't.
Exactly. We are just the messengers today.
Right. We are engaging in an impartial exploration of the source material. The claims we're going to break down today, which touch on government policy, immigration dynamics, and economic drivers, well, they are the structural arguments made in the text.
We aren't here to validate every assertion or pick a side.
No, not at all. We're here to unpack the architecture of this specific perspective, looking closely at the why and the how behind this viewpoint, so you can understand exactly how these systems are supposedly interacting.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the material makes a really sharp distinction right out of the gate. It argues that the media, the international community, and even the public are entirely focused on the what.
Right, the observable events.
Yeah, we are shown the clashes, the riots, the immediate visceral conflict on the streets. But we are completely blind to the why. And to illustrate this, there's a fascinating historical point made here.
Yeah, about South Africa's history of migration.
Exactly. The source points out that South Africa hasn't traditionally been a closed-off fortress. For decades, it has actually been highly open to people from across the African continent. So the obvious question is, what changed?
It's a very fair question.
But I have to push back on this premise just a little bit. If I see a video of local citizens attacking a foreign national or, burning a migrant-owned shop, my brain immediately says, well, that is xenophobia. How is it not? I mean, it looks and acts exactly like interpersonal prejudice.
Yeah, and it's a vital question to ask. And the text actually doesn't shy away from it at all. The material does not deny the reality on the ground.
So it admits the prejudice is real.
Oh, explicitly. It states that xenophobic elements and opportunistic criminal elements absolutely exist in these scenarios. You can observe them. But the analytical argument being made is one of scale and structure.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning that reducing a massive, systemic, nationwide collapse to just xenophobia is a failure of diagnosis. It takes a surface-level symptom, the violence, and incorrectly treats it as the root cause.
Oh, I see. Which means you end up treating a symptom while the underlying disease just keeps spreading.
Precisely. If society accepts that the problem is purely xenophobia, then it's just framed as an issue of interpersonal hatred.
Right, so your solution is just to run social awareness campaigns. You never actually have to look at the massive systems governing the country.
And that is the exact vulnerability the text points out. By accepting the emotional narrative, you ignore the structural what that is actually happening.
Well, yes.
The observable reality today isn't just the mere presence of foreigners, which, as you noted, has a long history in the region, particularly in sectors like mining, where migrant labor was historically regulated and housed.
Right, there were structures in place for that.
Exactly. The structural reality today is entirely porous borders. It is an uncontrolled, undocumented influx of individuals arriving from across the globe into informal settlements. That is a radically different mechanism than historical migration.
Wow, yeah. That distinction naturally leads us into the structural reality. Because if the core issue is an uncontrolled border, you immediately have to look at the people holding the keys to that border.
You do. You have to look at the state.
It's like, okay, think of it like a nightclub owner. It's like a nightclub owner completely removing the bouncers, dismantling the velvet rope, taking away all the capacity limits, letting thousands of people pour into a room built for 300.
Sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
Right. And then the owner blames the patrons for being aggressive when a stampede happens near the bar.
That is a perfect analogy. And taking that analogy a step further, imagine if the nightclub owner actually stood to make a massive profit from the stampede itself.
Wait, really? The text goes there.
Oh, it goes right there. The material points the finger squarely at the management of the state, specifically elements within the African National Congress government.
The ANC.
Yes. The argument is that this level of uncontrolled, undocumented movement is simply not normal for any functioning sovereign state anywhere in the world. The text cites massive mismanagement and a systemic failure to maintain border sovereignty.
But you mentioned profit. That sounds like more than just mismanagement.
It is. It shifts the analysis away from mere negligence or incompetence, moving into something far more calculated.
Right. It explores the economic incentives. It isn't just a matter of the government dropping the ball. There's an active financial mechanism at play here.
Exactly. The structural breakdown of the border serves the bottom line of specific economic interests. The text argues there is an alignment between elements of the state, Western-aligned big business, and political elites.
So how does a broken border make them money?
The underlying economic mechanism is straightforward but highly damaging. An influx of undocumented people creates a massive shadow workforce.
Because undocumented workers essentially don't exist on paper.
Right. They are invisible to labor protections. If you have a massive pool of undocumented labor, they operate completely outside the boundaries of minimum wage laws, safety regulations, and union protections.
So employers have immense leverage.
Complete leverage. They can pay fractional wages and hold the unspoken threat of deportation over these workers. This active circumvention of labor laws systematically drives down the median wage and displaces local workers, generating immense social friction.
The chaos, in economic terms, is highly profitable for those at the top.
Very profitable.
But wait, I have to ask, if this chaos is intentionally allowed, or at least tolerated, for corporate profit, wouldn't the resulting infrastructure collapse eventually hurt those same businesses? I mean, a broken country isn't good for commerce.
That brings us to the concept of elite capture. The people making or ignoring these policies are often completely insulated from their effects.
Oh, so they don't even feel the collapse.
Not at all. They live in gated communities with private security, private health care, and private solar grids. They are extracting the cheap labor without having to share in the burden of the crumbling public infrastructure.
Wow. So the friction only happens at the street level, among the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
That completely flips the script. It means the unrest isn't just irrational, localized hatred. It's the inevitable friction generated by a labor system that has been intentionally deregulated in the shadows.
Yes, it's engineered friction.
But how on earth do you sell that to the public? A government can't just stand up at a press conference and say, hey, everyone, we are dissolving border enforcement so massive corporations can bypass labor laws.
No, they definitely can't say that out loud. They need a public relations cover.
Right. And the material points out that they achieve this by weaponizing cultural values, specifically the concept of Ubuntu.
Yeah, and Ubuntu is a profoundly beautiful and deeply unifying African philosophy. It centers on shared humanity, compassion, and the interconnectedness of communities. The idea that, I am because we are.
It's a core cultural pillar.
It is. But the text argues that the language of Ubuntu is being deliberately distorted by politicians and elites to justify the reality of porous borders. Well, when citizens complain about the systemic strain on their towns, the elite response is essentially, we must welcome everyone without limits. To do otherwise violates Ubuntu.
But the text argues that applying Ubuntu this way is actually a total violation of traditional African governance. It's using a historical concept out of its actual mechanical context.
Yes, it is entirely stripped of its historical mechanics. In traditional Bantu societies, integration was not a free-for-all. You couldn't just walk into a neighboring community and anonymously set up camp.
There were rules.
Very strict rules. There were established structural mechanisms. The material specifically highlights practices like ukubekwa.
Okay, I saw that term. How does a process like ukubekwa actually work in practice?
It is a formal vetting and integration process. If a newcomer arrives, they are formally presented to the community leadership, often the inkosai, or chief. Their background is established.
So they can't just be anonymous.
No, not at all. And a local family usually has to vouch for them, creating a chain of accountability. They are allocated land, But that comes with specific civic duties and mutual obligations to the community.
That makes a lot of sense. It builds trust from day one.
Exactly. These systems existed for a very specific reason, to protect the integrity, safety, and balance of the society while still allowing for hospitality. What is happening in South Africa today, the complete removal of structural vetting, is the exact opposite of traditional African governance.
And when you strip away that kind of structural vetting, you don't get a borderless utopia. You get a massive blind spot. And blind spots are where threats incubate.
They absolutely are.
I was reading through the security section of the source material, and I was genuinely shocked. This completely shifts the narrative away from a quote-unquote social cohesion problem and reveals a terrifying national security crisis.
What's fascinating here is how quickly the text pivots from abstract social theory to documented geopolitical red flags. When the state refuses to vet who is crossing the border, it loses control over what those individuals are doing once they're inside.
Which is terrifying when you think about it.
It is. The material points to authorities in neighboring Lesotho raising official alarms about their nationals allegedly receiving illegal military-style training inside South African borders.
That stops being an immigration debate entirely. That is a militant threat operating in the shadows of the state.
And the examples are highly concrete. The text cites a specific event in 2024 where dozens of foreign nationals were arrested in the Mpumalanga province. They were discovered at what authorities suspected to be a covert military-style training site.
Wait, really? 2024? That is incredibly recent.
Yes, it's a current and active issue. These are hard security signals. Other sovereign states, like Eswatini, are officially taking note of the instability radiating outward from South Africa.
So the lack of borders isn't just an economic tool, it's a regional security hazard.
Right. It highlights a brutal reality. The exact same unmanaged border that allows for cheap, exploitable labor also allows for unchecked militant organization.
Which means the system is failing everyone simultaneously. And if we follow the logic here, we have to move from the macro level of national security down to the micro level, to the everyday reality of the people trapped inside this system.
Because the local citizens are the ones bearing the brunt of this.
Exactly. Because you have this massive undocumented influx of people, but you certainly don't have a massive influx of new power plants, hospitals, or schools to match it.
No, you don't. The physical math, the infrastructure simply does not work. The economic infrastructure of South Africa, the electricity grid, the healthcare clinics, the water sanitation systems, was designed for a specific carrying capacity.
It can only handle so many people.
Right. It was never designed to handle an exponential, uncontrolled population expansion, especially not one operating largely outside the formal tax base.
It reminds me of the classic economic concept of the tragedy of the commons.
Oh, yeah, that's a great comparison.
Yeah, you have a shared, finite public resource, like a local health clinic. When a system is regulated, access is managed, so the resource survives for everyone.
But when all regulation is removed...
Exactly. When you remove the rules and a massive influx of desperate people arrives, every individual acts rationally by trying to get as much of the resources possible to survive. The result isn't malicious, but the outcome is that the clinic completely collapses under the weight.
That is an incredibly accurate way to view the decay. It is the predictable, mathematical outcome of unmanaged systems. You are taking a society already burdened by deep historical inequality and extreme unemployment, and you are flooding its fragile public commons.
And people react to that scarcity.
They do. The psychological resulting condition is what the text calls survival mode.
So what does this all mean for the people on the ground? I mean, if I'm a local South African without a job, dealing with daily blackouts and failing clinics, I am desperate.
Understandably so.
But if I'm an immigrant who just crossed the border, fleeing a war zone or extreme poverty, I'm also desperate. Both groups are pushed to the absolute brink.
And that is the profound psychological point the material makes. When basic livelihoods and access to fundamental resources are directly threatened, high-minded ideology disappears.
You stop thinking about philosophy.
Completely. Identity becomes secondary. Pure survival becomes the primary driver. The local South Africans reacting to this systemic strain are operating in pure survival mode.
But the immigrants are operating in the exact same mode. They aren't the villains of this story either.
Far from it. The text is very clear that the vast majority of people crossing into South Africa are not coming to philosophize about Pan-African unity.
They're trying to feed their families.
Exactly. They are fleeing economic collapse, systemic corruption, and violent conflict in their own home countries. They are acting as highly rational actors in a brutal environment, Trying to survive is not a localized malicious trait. It is the baseline human condition.
So you have two highly vulnerable populations, both acting rationally to survive, placed into an engineered pressure cooker with finite resources.
Yes.
And while they are forced into conflict over the scraps of a failing grid, the people who actually designed or allowed that system to break are sitting comfortably at the top, pointing down and saying, look at all that xenophobia down there.
It is a masterclass in deflection.
It really is. It's almost unbelievable how well that narrative works.
Well, it forces us to ask a crucial concluding question, which the text grapples with directly. If everyone is forced into isolated, rational self-interest by a broken system, what happens to the larger dream for the continent?
The Pan-African dream.
Right. South Africa has historically been viewed as uniquely positioned to be a convergence point for African peoples. It has the potential to be a foundation for genuine continental unity, shared development, and collective advancement.
But based on the mechanics we've discussed today, that unity is impossible without a structural framework. You can't just throw people together and hope for the best.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the reality on the ground is the exact opposite of a unified melting pot. Because there is no coordinated Pan-African framework, no shared vision, and zero leadership driving actual structured integration, the result is total fragmentation.
Yeah, the material paints a very vivid picture of this fragmentation.
Yeah.
You don't see cohesive, integrated communities.
No, you see isolated clusters surviving in silos.
Exactly. Nigerians operating in specific economic zones, Zimbabweans and others, Somalis, Ethiopians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, all siloed off, pursuing their own survival independently.
The material distills this into a strict law of reality. Where there is no structure, there is no order. And where there is no order, chaos emerges.
It's a very stark warning.
It is. South Africa is currently standing at a geopolitical crossroads. It has to decide whether it will build the robust, accountable structures required to actually foster safe integration and African unity, or if it will simply become a permanent case study in unmanaged, systemic collapse.
And as long as the global community, the media and the public, keep relying on that single word xenophobia, we can't even see the crossroads.
We are blind to the actual choices we need to make.
Yeah, we are diagnosing a massive structural failure as a mere moral failing. You can preach tolerance all day long, but tolerance does not rebuild power grids, it doesn't enforce labor laws against exploitative corporations, and it certainly doesn't secure a border against covert militant training camps.
Diagnosis dictates the cure. If you misdiagnose the root cause, your solutions will only ever treat the symptom. Until the invisible structures of economic exploitation and governance failure are addressed, the street-level friction will continue.
This has been an incredibly eye-opening journey through this source material. I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a great discussion. Thanks for having me.
By moving past the oversimplified narrative of xenophobia, we've unpacked a massive web of interconnected mechanics. We looked at an uncontrolled border functioning as a shadow labor market, economic elites insulated from the consequences of their policies, the distortion of traditional African integration systems like Ukubekwa.
Not to mention the severe national security vulnerabilities.
Yes, and ultimately, a tragic, shared human struggle for survival in a collapsing public commons.
It fundamentally changes the lens through which you view this kind of conflict. It trains you to look past the visceral, interpersonal clashes on the street and identify the invisible economic and political structures that actually engineered the conditions for that conflict.
Absolutely. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. If a government or an economic elite can successfully convince the public that their daily suffering, their lack of jobs, and their failing infrastructure is entirely the fault of their neighbors, how many other global crises are currently being hidden behind a convenient one-word label?
That is a very unsettling thought.
It is, isn't it? Think about the international headlines you scrolled past this morning. When you see a crisis neatly summarized in a single word, are you seeing the actual root cause, or are you just being sold the symptom? Keep questioning the frame, keep looking for the underlying mechanics, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.